The Eternal Drink. The festival was in full swing, with the village square bursting with laughter, music, and the rich aroma of festive delicacies. Bright lanterns swayed gently in the evening breeze, their glow mirrored in the eyes of joyous villagers. Children ran around chasing each other, their giggles mingling with the sound of traditional drums. But amidst this sea of celebration, Arv and his small group of friends sat huddled in a quiet corner, their faces somber. "Why so glum, Arv?" one of his friends asked, nudging him. Arv sighed, glancing at the crowd. "I promised you all that I'd treat you to some wine tonight. I thought it would make this festival even more special. But—" he hesitated, lowering his voice. "I couldn't arrange for it. My father would have my head if he knew I even tried." His friends exchanged disappointed glances, but said nothing, their silence heavier than any words. It was supposed to be a night of celebration, but Arv's broken promise had cast a shadow over their mood. Zion, Arv's grandfather, noticed the group from a distance. The old man had always been sharp, his keen eyes missing nothing. With his walking stick tapping lightly on the cobblestone path, he approached the group. "Hey, boys," Zion greeted, his voice warm but curious. "What's this? The whole village is dancing, feasting, and singing, yet you're sitting here like lost kittens. What's bothering you?" The friends looked at Arv, who hesitated before mumbling, "Nothing, Grandpa." "It's nothing? Nothing doesn't make faces this long," Zion countered, gesturing with his stick. "Come now, tell me. What's going on, Arv?" Arv glanced at his friends, then reluctantly confessed. "I wanted to make tonight memorable for everyone, Grandpa. I told them I'd treat them to wine, but I couldn't get any. Now, I've let them down." Zion chuckled softly, his laughter warm and infectious. "Ah, so that's what this is about. Boys and their mischief." He leaned in closer, his tone dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "If it's wine you wanted, I can get you something even better. But it comes with a price." "Better than wine?" Arv's eyes widened in surprise. "What could that be, Grandpa?" "Promise me you won't breathe a word of this to anyone," Zion said, his gaze suddenly serious. "I promise," Arv replied eagerly, his curiosity now fully piqued. "Good," Zion said, standing upright. "Come with me. Just you. Your friends can wait here." The group exchanged puzzled looks, but none of them dared to question the old man. Arv rose, his excitement bubbling beneath a layer of apprehension, and followed Zion as he began to walk away from the festival grounds. The path Zion took was unfamiliar to Arv. They left behind the lively village square, venturing into the quieter outskirts. The cheerful noise of the festival faded into the background, replaced by the whisper of the wind and the occasional hoot of an owl. "Grandpa," Arv said hesitantly, glancing at the shadows cast by their torches, "where are we going?" "You'll see," Zion replied cryptically. "Patience, my boy. What I'm about to show you is something very few have ever seen. Not even your father." Arv's mind raced with possibilities, but nothing could have prepared him for what lay ahead. After what felt like an eternity, they arrived at a large, weathered wooden shed. The structure stood alone in the middle of a barren field, its aged wood groaning softly in the wind. Zion reached for the shed's heavy door, pushing it open with a creak that seemed to echo into the night. Inside, the shed appeared unremarkable at first glance, filled with farming tools, dry wood, and bales of hay. But Zion's movements were deliberate as he walked to a particular spot and tapped his cane against the ground. "Here," Zion said, his voice steady. "Help me lift this." Arv bent down, his hands grasping a concealed wooden door embedded in the floor. He struggled but managed to lift it, revealing a hidden ladder descending into darkness. "Go on," Zion urged. "Climb down. I'll be right behind you." Arv hesitated but obeyed, descending cautiously. The air grew cooler as he went deeper, the faint smell of earth and dampness growing stronger. When he reached the bottom, Zion joined him, lighting a torch mounted on the wall. The flickering flame illuminated the space, and Ariv's breath caught in his throat. The room was vast, its walls lined with human skeletons arranged meticulously. Some were upright in niches, while others lay flat, their bones yellowed with age. The sight was both awe-inspiring and deeply unsettling. What is this place?" Ariv stammered, his voice barely above a whisper. "This," Zion said, his tone reverent, "is our ancestral crypt. Every member of our family, for generations, has been laid to rest here. And one day, I will join them. So will your father. And you?" Ariv took a shaky step back. "Me? No, Grandpa. This is strange, unsettling," Zion interrupted, his eyes soft but firm. "It is at first, but this place holds history, legacy, and secrets you cannot yet comprehend. And it is here," he added, walking toward a corner, "that I keep something truly special." Ariv followed, his heart pounding. Zion reached behind a stack of wooden beams, producing a small, intricately designed bottle. The liquid inside shimmered faintly under the torchlight, its color unlike anything Ariv had ever seen. "This," Zion said, holding up the bottle, "is Neil Amrit. It's not just a drink, Ariv. It's a piece of our family's history, a connection to those who came before us. And tonight it's yours." Ariv stared at the bottle, a mixture of wonder and apprehension in his eyes. "How is this better than wine?" Zion smiled faintly. "You'll know when you drink it under sunlight. But for now, take it. And remember, what you've seen and heard here tonight must never leave this place." Ariv nodded, gripping the bottle tightly. The crypt seemed to close in around him, its secrets weighing heavily on his mind as he followed Zion back up the ladder, leaving behind the haunting legacy of their family. As Ariv followed Zion back through the crypt, the faint light from the torch flickered across the stone walls, casting eerie shadows that danced and swayed. Ariv couldn't help but feel a strange mix of awe and dread as he absorbed the reality of this hidden world beneath his village. His gaze wandered, taking in the rows of ancestral skeletons, the ornate carvings on the walls, and the countless stories that seemed to seep from the very stones around him. But then, his eyes landed on something unusual. A bricked wall, unlike the rest of the crypt's smooth stone surfaces. It was crude in comparison, the bricks unevenly stacked, as if the wall had been hastily constructed. Moss clung to its surface, and the air around it felt colder somehow, heavy with an inexplicable tension. "Grandpa," Ariv said, pausing mid-step and pointing at the wall. "What's behind that?" Zion, who had been walking ahead, froze. His grip tightened on the torch, and for a moment, the only sound was the faint crackle of the flame. Slowly, he turned to face Ariv, his expression unreadable. "That wall," Zion began, his voice low and deliberate, "is something you must never concern yourself with." "But why?" Ariv pressed, his curiosity now fully piqued. "It doesn't look like the rest of the crypt. Did someone build it later? What's behind it?" Zion's eyes darkened, and he took a step closer to Ariv, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "Behind that wall lies hatred, jealousy, and revenge. Nothing good ever came from what's on the other side. Forget it ever existed." Ariv blinked, taken aback by the intensity of Zion's words. "Hatred and jealousy? What do you mean? Is there something dangerous back there?" Zion sighed deeply, leaning against his cane. His face seemed to age even more in the flickering torchlight, the weight of some long-buried memory pressing heavily on him. "Dangerous? Perhaps. Cursed? Most definitely. That wall was built for a reason, Ariv. Our ancestors didn't seal it off lightly. They left it as a warning to those who came after them. To us. But what's the warning?" Ariv asked, his voice a mix of curiosity and unease. Zion hesitated, as if debating whether to share more. Finally, he spoke, his tone grave. "Long ago, our family was torn apart by greed. Brothers turned against each other. Sisters betrayed sisters, and blood was spilled over a feud so bitter that it threatened to destroy everything. The hatred festered, twisting their souls until they became something unnatural. The wall was built to seal away their remains and their vengeance. Arif shivered, his grip tightening on the bottle of Neil Amrit he still carried. "Are you saying there are more skeletons back there?" Zion shook his head slowly. "Not just skeletons, Arif. What lies beyond that wall isn't something that should ever be disturbed. Their anger, their malice, it lingers. It's said that those who tamper with the wall invite that hatred into their own lives. That's why it was sealed and why it must remain untouched." Arif's eyes remained fixed on the wall. Despite Zion's ominous words, he couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to the story, something hidden and unsaid. "But what if?" he began, then stopped, unsure how to phrase the question. "What if what?" Zion asked sharply, his tone laced with suspicion. "What if there's something valuable back there?" Arif ventured hesitantly. "Something they wanted to protect, not just hide. How can we be sure it's all just hatred and revenge? What if it's—" "Enough!" Zion's voice echoed through the crypt, startling Arif. The old man's eyes blazed with an intensity Arif had never seen before. "You think you know better than generations of our ancestors? You think you can unlock their secrets without consequence? This isn't a game, Arif. That wall isn't a treasure chest. It's a grave marker, a barrier between us and their darkness." Arif shrank back, nodding quickly. I'm sorry, Grandpa. I didn't mean to disrespect." Zion sighed, his anger ebbing as quickly as it had flared. He placed a hand on Arif's shoulder, his grip firm but not unkind. "I know you're curious. That's natural. But some things are better left unknown. The world is full of mysteries, Arif, and not all of them are meant to be solved. Do you understand?" Arif nodded again, though the nagging questions in his mind refused to be silenced. "Good," Zion said, his voice softening. "Now, let's leave this place. The crypt isn't meant for the living, and we've lingered long enough." As they ascended the ladder back to the shed, Arif couldn't help but glance back at the bricked wall one last time. His grandfather's words echoed in his mind, but so did his own unspoken thoughts. What could be so terrible that it needed to be sealed away like that? And why did it feel like the wall was calling to him, its cold presence reaching out to him even as they left it behind? When they emerged into the open air, the cool night breeze felt like a relief, washing away the oppressive weight of the crypt. But Arif knew that the mysteries he had glimpsed below would haunt him, no matter how much Zion urged him to forget. As the cool night breeze drifted through the village, Zion and Arif sat by the fire in the old shed, the faint glow of the embers dancing across their faces. Arif still held the small bottle of Neil Amrit, its deep sapphire liquid swirling mysteriously under the flickering light. His thoughts were heavy with the crypt secrets, but his curiosity about the drink outweighed his unease. "Grandpa," Arif began hesitantly, turning the bottle over in his hands. "What is this really? Why do you call it Neil Amrit? What makes it so special?" Zion looked at Arif, a shadow of both pride and caution flickering across his expression. He reached out, taking the bottle gently from Arif's grasp, and held it up to the firelight. The blue liquid seemed to shimmer, almost as if alive. "Neil Amrit," Zion said slowly, his voice carrying the weight of centuries-old lore, "is unlike anything you've ever known. It isn't just a drink. It's history, legacy, and sacrifice, all bottled together. It's as rare as the stars on a cloudy night, and its story is as old as our ancestors." Arif leaned in, captivated by Zion's tone. "What do you mean? How is it made?" Zion paused, as if considering how much to reveal. Finally, he placed the bottle carefully on the ground between them and clasped his hands. "It begins with death," he said bluntly. Arif blinked, caught off guard. "Death?" "Yes," Zion replied. "The essence of Neil Amrit comes from the past, from those who've gone before us. Its creation isn't for the faint of heart, nor for those who shy away from the truths of life and death. What truths? Arv asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Zion's eyes seemed to glow with an intensity that made Arv shiver. The truth that our lives are fleeting, yet our spirits linger. The truth that every sip of this drink carries, with it whispers of those who once walked this earth. To create Neil Amrit, you need more than just the finest ingredients. You need the presence of the departed. Arv stared at Zion, his mind racing. You mean it's made in the crypt? Zion nodded. Exactly. The crypt isn't just a resting place for our ancestors. It's also where Neil Amrit is born. The drink is aged in barrels placed among the dead. Their presence, their energy, their memories seep into the liquid over time. It's said that the drink absorbs their essence, their emotions, and even fragments of their souls. That's, Arv struggled to find the right word. Creepy. But kind of amazing, too. Zion chuckled, his laughter carrying a hint of melancholy. It is both, my boy. That's what makes it so prized. Neil Amrit isn't something you can replicate. It's a blend of the tangible and the ethereal, of craftsmanship and the supernatural. No two bottles are ever the same because no two spirits are alike. Arv picked up the bottle again, holding it delicately, as if it might break under his touch. But who came up with this? Why would anyone even think of making something like this? Zion's expression turned somber, his gaze distant. It was born out of desperation, he said softly. Long ago, our village faced a terrible famine. The crops withered, the rivers dried, and hope seemed to vanish. The people turned to their ancestors for guidance, for blessings. They believed that by communing with the dead, they could find a way to survive. How does a drink help with that? Arv asked. Zion sighed. It wasn't meant to be a drink at first. The villagers sought to connect with the spirits through rituals, offerings, and prayers. In one such ritual, they left jars of spiced nectar in the crypt as an offering to the ancestors. When they returned months later, the nectar had transformed. Its color had changed. Its aroma had deepened. And its effects, well, let's just say it wasn't ordinary anymore. What happened when they drank it? Arv asked, his voice tinged with both curiosity and apprehension. They claimed it gave them visions. Zion replied, his voice hushed. Visions of the past, of forgotten wisdom, and even glimpses of the future. They believed the spirits were speaking to them, guiding them. Word spread, and Neil Amrit became revered, not just as a drink, but as a bridge between the living and the dead. Arv's brow furrowed as he considered this. But it's not just about the visions, is it? No, Zion admitted. Over time, people realized that Neil Amrit had another effect. It didn't just connect them to the spirits. It also brought euphoria, clarity, and a strange sense of peace. It became a symbol of celebration, used sparingly and only on the most sacred occasions. Then why do we have it now? Arv asked, gesturing to the bottle. Zion smiled faintly. Because tonight is sacred in its own way. The festival, the bond of friendship, the ties of family, all these things are worth honoring. But remember, Arv, Neil Amrit is not to be taken lightly. It carries not only the blessings of the dead but also their burdens. Treat it with respect, or it may reveal truths you're not ready to face. Arv looked at the bottle one last time, a new weight settling in his chest. He wasn't sure if he was ready to face whatever the drink might reveal, but one thing was certain. Neil Amrit was no ordinary drink. It was a piece of his heritage, a link to a past he was only beginning to understand. The fire crackled softly in the corner of the room as Arv leaned forward, his curiosity ignited by Zion's enigmatic stories. He had barely wrapped his head around the mysterious origins of Neil Amrit when Zion's gaze turned distant, as if looking into another time. Arv recognized that look. It was the prelude to another tale. What are you thinking about, Grandpa? Arv asked, his voice tentative. Does it have something to do with the crypt? Zion sighed deeply, the weight of history pressing down on him. He gestured for Ariv to sit closer, his tone suddenly heavy. If you want to understand the true spirit of Neil Amrit, you must know the story of Arian and Cian. It begins in the year 1560. Ariv's eyes widened. 1560? That's centuries ago. Indeed, Zion replied, his voice almost reverent. Back then, our village was not as you see it now. It was a hub of art and culture, where poets and musicians would gather to share their works and compete for glory. Among them, one man stood above the rest, Arian. Arian? Ariv echoed. Yes, Arian, Zion affirmed. He was a poet of extraordinary talent. His words could move even the hardest hearts, and his presence lit up every gathering. The people adored him, and his fame spread far beyond the village. Ariv tilted his head. So, he was like a celebrity? Zion chuckled softly. You could say that. But Arian wasn't just talented. He was kind. He treated everyone with respect, no matter their station. It was this combination of brilliance and humility that made him beloved by all, well, almost all. Ariv caught the edge in Zion's tone. Almost? Zion's face darkened. There was one who despised him, Cian, another poet. While Arian's verses were celebrated, Cian's were often overshadowed. Cian was talented in his own right, but his works lacked the soul, the magic that Arian's possessed. And as Arian's star rose, Cian's jealousy festered. What did Cian do? Ariv asked, leaning in. Zion shook his head slowly. At first, he tried to outshine Arian through his poetry. But no matter how hard he worked, he could never match Arian's charm or the effortless beauty of his words. The village would always gather in greater numbers to hear Arian's recitals, leaving Cian to stew in bitterness. Ariv frowned. That's not Arian's fault, though. No, it wasn't, Zion agreed. But jealousy doesn't follow reason. Cian's resentment grew darker when Arian captured the heart of Lena. Lena? Ariv asked, his curiosity piqued. Zion smiled faintly, though the smile didn't reach his eyes. Lena was the most enchanting woman in the village, with a spirit as vibrant as her beauty. She loved poetry, and Arian's verses spoke to her soul. She saw in him a kindred spirit, someone who shared her passion for life. Cian, however, had also long admired Lena. From afar, Ariv winced. That must have been hard for Cian. Hard, Zion repeated, his voice sharp. It was unbearable for him. To see the woman he desired fall for the man he envied most was a wound too deep to bear. And so, his envy turned to hatred. The fire crackled louder, as if punctuating Zion's words. Ariv shivered despite the warmth of the flames. What did Cian do? Zion's voice dropped, almost to a whisper. He plotted. He couldn't bear to lose, not to Arian. Cian began to weave a plan, one that would strip Arian of everything he held dear. But Ariv, understand this, jealousy is like a poison. It consumes the heart of the one who harbors it. Ariv stared at Zion, his throat dry. What kind of plan? Did he hurt Arian? That, my boy, Zion said gravely, is a tale for another moment. What you must understand now is that Arian and Cian's story isn't just about rivalry. It's about the consequences of envy, of how unchecked emotions can destroy not only others, but oneself. Their tale became a lesson, a warning that lives on, even today. Ariv's mind whirled with questions, but one stood out above the rest. Does this story have something to do with Neil Amrit? Zion nodded slowly, his eyes glinting in the firelight. It does, but for now, remember this. The past has a way of shaping the present. The echoes of Arian and Cian's choices still linger in our lives, just as the essence of the dead lingers in Neil Amrit. The room fell silent, the air thick with unspoken truths. Ariv knew that the story was far from over, but he also understood that Zion would reveal it in his own time. As the flames danced and flickered, Ariv's thoughts were filled with images of Arian and Cian, of love and jealousy, and of a rivalry that had stood the test of centuries. The flickering torchlight cast long, ominous shadows along the damp walls of the cellar. Arian followed Cian deeper into the underground labyrinth, his footsteps echoing softly. There was an uneasy feeling in the air, but Arian brushed it off. After all, Cian had invited him with the promise of sharing Neil Amrit, the rare and intoxicating drink that was said to carry the essence of eternity. "Cian, this is quite the place," Arian remarked, his voice carrying a note of curiosity. "I didn't even know this cellar existed." Cian, walking a few steps ahead, turned his head slightly. A faint smile played on his lips, though it didn't reach his eyes. "Few do. It's a secret passed down in my family. A fitting location for something as extraordinary as Neil Amrit, wouldn't you agree?" Arian nodded, his poet's imagination alight with intrigue. Yet, there was something in Cian's tone that made his unease grow. "It's certainly otherworldly," he replied. "But why the secrecy? Wouldn't sharing it with others make it even more cherished?" Cian paused, his hand brushing against a pillar as he turned to face Arian fully. "Not everything is meant to be shared," he said, his voice low. "Sometimes, the value of something lies in keeping it hidden, treasured." Arian furrowed his brow, sensing an undertone he couldn't quite place. "You speak of Neil Amrit, as if it holds more than just its taste. Is there something you're not telling me?" Cian's smile widened, but there was no warmth in it. "Oh, Arian, there's so much you don't know." Before Arian could respond, Cian gestured toward a small table set against the wall. On it sat a goblet, the liquid inside glowing faintly under the torchlight. "There it is," Cian said, his voice almost reverent. "Neil Amrit, the drink of eternity." Arian stepped forward, his fascination overcoming his hesitation. The drink's luminescent hue was mesmerizing. He reached out to touch the goblet, but paused. "Why offer this to me, Cian? We've never been particularly close." Cian's expression hardened for a brief moment before softening into something unreadable. "Perhaps I've been wrong about you," he said. "Perhaps it's time to bury the rivalry and embrace friendship." Arian hesitated, searching Cian's face for sincerity. "Friendship?" he echoed. "Yes," Cian replied smoothly. "Drink, Arian. Let's toast to new beginnings." But before Arian could lift the goblet, he felt a sharp pain at the back of his neck. The world spun as darkness encroached, and he collapsed to the cold, stone floor. When Arian regained consciousness, his hands were bound tightly behind him, and his body was secured to a rough, unyielding pillar. The chill of the tunnel seeped into his bones. He struggled against the restraints, his breath coming in quick, panicked bursts. "Cian," he shouted, his voice echoing in the darkness. "What is this madness? Untie me." Cian's laughter filled the tunnel, a sound devoid of humor. He stepped out of the shadows, holding a torch that cast his face in an eerie glow. "Madness, Arian? No, this is justice." Arian's eyes blazed with confusion and fury. "Justice for what? What have I done to deserve this?" Cian leaned in, his face inches from Arian's. "You took everything from me," he hissed. "The admiration, the praise, the love. Lena, you didn't even have to try, did you? Everything I ever wanted fell effortlessly into your lap." Arian froze at the mention of Lena's name. "What are you talking about? Lena chose to love me, just as she could have chosen you. You can't force love, Cian." Cian's eyes burned with a dangerous light. "No, but I can take it away." With a twisted grin, Cian turned and walked a few paces into the shadows. He returned moments later, dragging a heavy object wrapped in tattered cloth. The air grew colder as he unveiled his grim prize. Arian's heart stopped. Lena's lifeless body lay before him, her once vibrant eyes now closed in eternal sleep. A scream of anguish tore from his throat. "Lena," he cried, his voice cracking with raw emotion. "What have you done?" Cian crouched beside the corpse, his fingers brushing a strand of hair from Lena's face. "She deserved better than you," he said softly, almost tenderly. She deserved someone who would move mountains for her. Instead, she chose a poet with pretty words. Arian struggled against his bonds, his wrists chafed and bleeding. "You're insane, Kian. You've killed her. She was innocent." Kian rose to his feet, his expression shifting from sorrow to triumph. "Innocence has no place in this world, Arian. Neither does your so-called brilliance." Arian's voice broke with desperation. "Please, Kian, don't do this. Whatever anger you feel, direct it at me, not her. Let me bury her, give her peace." Kian cut him off with a sharp laugh. "Peace? Oh, Arian, there will be no peace for either of you." He stepped back and signaled to a group of laborers who emerged from the shadows. At Kian's command, they began to wall up the tunnel, brick by brick. "You'll stay here," Kian said, his tone chillingly calm. "With her, forever. Your voices, your love, your poetry, silenced for eternity." As the wall rose, Arian's shouts turned into guttural cries of rage and sorrow. "Kian, you won't get away with this. Someone will find us." Kian's face disappeared behind the growing barrier. "No one will find you. And even if they do, they'll only discover the silence of the dead." The final brick was placed, and the tunnel was plunged into darkness. Arian's screams echoed briefly before fading into an eternal quiet, leaving only the sound of dripping water and the weight of Kian's twisted triumph. The air in the crypt was heavy with the scent of damp stone and age-old secrets. Ariv sat cross-legged on the cold floor, his eyes fixed on Zion, who paced slowly, his hands clasped behind his back. The flickering torchlight cast shadows that danced across the walls, creating an atmosphere thick with tension. Ariv's mind buzzed with the weight of the story he had just heard, a story that felt like it was dredged up from the darkest depths of history. Kian became a hero, Zion began, his voice soft but laden with bitterness. After Arian's disappearance, the village turned to Kian for solace. He was their shining light, their unshakable leader. Little did they know their hero was a monster. Ariv frowned, leaning forward slightly. But how? How does someone commit such horrors and still command respect? How does no one see the truth? Zion stopped pacing and looked at Ariv, his gaze piercing. Charisma Ariv. Kian had a way with people, a gift for twisting the narrative in his favor. He spun a tale of Arian's sudden departure, claiming the poet had abandoned the village for the allure of fame in the city. Ariv shook his head in disbelief. And no one doubted him? Zion gave a bitter laugh. Why would they? Kian was everything they needed. He was charming, resourceful, and always seemed to know how to make people feel safe. But more than that, he had Neil Amrit. Ariv's eyes narrowed. Neil Amrit? How does that fit into all this? Zion walked over to the table, where the goblet of the glowing liquid still sat, untouched. He picked it up, swirling the iridescent liquid inside. Neil Amrit isn't just intoxicating Ariv. It does something far more sinister. When prepared in the presence of death, when it soaks in the essence of the departed, it has the power to preserve youth, to charm, to enthrall. Ariv stared at the goblet, a chill running down his spine. You're saying Kian used this to stay young? Zion nodded solemnly. For over 50 years, while others aged and weathered, Kian remained the same, ageless, radiant, almost otherworldly. To the villagers, it was a sign of his greatness, a testament to his purity. They adored him, worshipped him even, and he made sure to keep them intoxicated with tales, with promises, and sometimes, with Neil Amrit. Ariv's voice dropped to a whisper. But he was a murderer. Yes, Zion said sharply, his voice cutting through the quiet like a blade. A murderer who thrived on the very darkness he created. The more lives he took, the more powerful he became. And yet, no one questioned him. Why would they? He was their protector, their eternal leader. Ariv's mind reeled as he tried to process it all. But why? Why didn't anyone notice his unnatural longevity, his secrets, Zion set the goblet down with a deliberate clink. Because fear and reverence are a potent combination, Arif. Kian controlled the narrative. Anyone who questioned him disappeared, their voices silenced like Aryans. And the villagers, drunk on his charm and the occasional sip of Neil Amrit, chose ignorance. It was easier that way. Arif rubbed his temples, overwhelmed. And all this time, the truth was buried here, beneath their feet. A man who should have been vilified instead became a legend. Zion sat down across from Arif, his expression grave. The irony of it all, isn't it? Kian ensured his immortality not just through his unnatural youth, but through the stories the villagers told about him. Stories that painted him as a hero. Arif leaned back against the wall, his head spinning. And the Neil Amrit? It's still here, still potent after all this time? Zion's gaze darkened. Yes, but it's more than just a drink, Arif. It's a curse. It binds you to the sins of the past. Once you taste it, you're part of the story, whether you want to be or not. The silence that followed was deafening, the weight of Zion's words pressing heavily on Arif's chest. He glanced at the glowing goblet, its light now seeming more sinister than alluring. What happened to Kian? Arif asked finally, his voice barely audible. Zion's lips curled into a faint, bitter smile. That, my friend, is a tale for another time. But know this, his legacy didn't end when his life did. The shadows of his deeds linger, even now. Arif shivered, the crypt's chill seeping deeper into his bones. The story of Kian wasn't just history. It was a living, breathing force that pulsed through the very air around them. And Arif couldn't shake the feeling that he had become a part of it, whether he liked it or not. Arif stared at the glowing bottle of Neil Amrit in his hands, its light casting an eerie glow on his face. The liquid seemed alive, swirling in hypnotic patterns, as if it were whispering secrets only he could hear. His fingers tightened around the glass, and his mind was a storm of conflicting emotions: curiosity, fear, temptation. Zion stood a few steps away, his arms crossed, watching Arif closely. His usually calm demeanor was replaced by an intensity that made the air feel charged. "It's not a game, Arif," Zion said, his voice low and steady. "What you're holding is more than just a drink. It's a piece of history soaked in pain, greed, and death." Arif looked up, his eyes wide. "But it's incredible, isn't it? Something like this, it's not just a drink. It's power. It's—" He hesitated, searching for the right words. "It's a chance to experience something no one else has." Zion's expression hardened. That's exactly what Kian thought. And look where it led him. Arif frowned, the weight of the bottle growing heavier in his hands. "I'm not Kian. I wouldn't misuse it. I just want to understand it. To know what it feels like." Zion stepped closer, his voice sharp now. "And what will you do once you understand it? Share it with your friends? Use it to make yourself famous? Do you think you can take something born of darkness and remain untouched by it?" Arif's grip on the bottle faltered, and he quickly steadied it. "I don't know," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "But can you blame me for being curious? You showed me all this. You brought me here. Did you expect me to just walk away and forget it?" "Yes," Zion replied without hesitation. "That's exactly what I wanted. I thought if you saw the truth, if you understood the cost of this so-called gift, you'd want no part of it." Arif shook his head, a bitter laugh escaping him. "You don't get it, do you? This is bigger than me. Bigger than you. How can I just walk away from something that has shaped centuries of lives, of lies? How can I leave without knowing what it's all for?" Zion sighed, his expression softening slightly. "Arif, understand the allure. I do. But I've seen what this drink can do, how it changes people. It starts with curiosity, with good intentions. But it never ends there. It consumes you, piece by piece." Arif looked down at the bottle again, the glow reflecting in his troubled eyes. "What if I don't drink it? What if I just keep it? Study it?" Zion's lips curled into a faint, rueful smile. And what happens when the temptation grows too strong? When the whispers of the past become louder than your resolve? You can't play with fire without expecting to get burned. The words hung in the air, and Arav felt the full weight of their meaning. He wanted to argue, to find a loophole that would let him hold onto the bottle without succumbing to its dark history. But deep down, he knew Zion was right. This wasn't just an artifact, it was a living curse, and he was already caught in its grip. Then, why didn't you destroy it? Arav asked suddenly, his voice tinged with frustration. If it's so dangerous, why not get rid of it? Zion's gaze grew distant, his jaw tightening. Because destruction isn't always the answer. Sometimes, preserving the past, even the darkest parts of it, is the only way to ensure its lessons aren't forgotten. Arav exhaled slowly, his mind racing. So, what do I do? Just leave it here, and pretend none of this happened. Zion stepped closer, his hand resting lightly on Arav's shoulder. That's a choice only you can make. But remember, Arav, this bottle doesn't just carry the past. It carries responsibility. Whatever you decide, you'll have to live with the consequences. Arav met Zion's eyes, the torchlight flickering between them. For the first time, the glow of the Neil Amrit felt less enchanting and more like a warning, a beacon of danger disguised as beauty. He held the bottle tightly, torn between his desire to uncover its mysteries and the growing fear of what it might cost him. I need time to think, Arav said finally, his voice steady but uncertain. Zion nodded, stepping back. Take all the time you need. But know this, the longer you hold on to it, the harder it will be to let go. As Zion's words settled into Arav's mind, the crypt grew silent once more, leaving only the faint hum of the Neil Amrit to fill the void. And in that silence, Arav realized the true weight of the decision before him, one that would shape not just his future, but the legacy of the past he had stumbled into. Arav stood at the entrance of the crypt, the weight of the Neil Amrit bottle in his hands. The once mesmerizing glow now seemed dimmer, as if it sensed the gravity of the decision looming over him. Zion watched him quietly, his expression unreadable, but his eyes betrayed a hint of sadness and hope. This is it, Arav, Zion said, his voice steady but solemn. The legacy, the burden, it's yours now. I've carried it long enough. What you do with it is your choice, but remember, every action echoes through time. This bottle has seen centuries of greed, betrayal, and pain. Will you let it write another chapter, or will you end the story here? Arav turned the bottle slowly, watching the liquid inside swirl like a trapped storm. You make it sound so simple, he said, his voice tinged with frustration. But it's not. Destroying this, it's like erasing history. And keeping it? That's carrying a curse. History isn't erased by letting go of its symbols, Zion replied. It's preserved in the lessons we take from it. Do you want to be the next Kian? Or Aryan? Or worse, someone who lets this darkness spread again? Arav looked up at Zion, searching for answers in the older man's face. Why me? Why not just bury it deeper where no one can find it? Zion smiled faintly, his expression softening. Because secrets have a way of surfacing. And because I believe you can do what I couldn't. You're at a crossroads, Arav. You've seen the truth, felt its pull. You understand its power. And its cost. For a long moment, Arav said nothing. The crypt around him felt heavier, as if the centuries of pain and betrayal were pressing down on him. Slowly, he raised the bottle, its glow illuminating his conflicted face. I don't want this, he whispered. I don't want to be part of this cycle. Zion nodded, a flicker of relief crossing his face. Then you know what to do. With a deep breath, Arav turned and hurled the bottle against the ancient stone wall. The glass shattered with a deafening crash, and the glowing liquid spilled out, hissing and evaporating into the air. The crypt seemed to shudder, as though exhaling centuries of pent-up sorrow. Zion placed a hand on Arav's shoulder, his grip firm. You've made the right choice. The legacy ends here, with you. As they climbed out of the crypt and into the first rays of dawn, Arv felt a strange lightness, as though a weight he hadn't fully realized he was carrying had been lifted. The past remained, etched into the stones of the crypt below, but its hold on the future was broken. For the first time, Arv saw the world with clear eyes, free of the shadows of jealousy, hatred, and deception. And as he walked away from the hidden cellar, he knew he wasn't just leaving behind a legacy of secrets. He was forging a new one, rooted in hope and the freedom to choose a different path.